Hello. It was very common that Hasidic Rebbe's were closely related. Rabbi Nachum Mendel of Kosov was the brother-in-law of Rav Uri of Strelisk, and it once happened that Rav Uri of Strelisk was going to visit his brother-in-law in Kosov, and when he came, hundreds of Hasidim from all over came to see the two tzaddikim together. Among them was one Reb Moshe who had been very wealthy. He held an important lease from a Polish prince, and he had been a great Baal Tzedakah, but recently had fallen on bad times, and he couldn't afford to pay the lease. The Polish Paritz was threatening to have him thrown in jail, and his family in jail, and all sorts of other difficult things. So after Shabbos, this Reb Moshe went to the Reb Uri of Strelisk and poured out his woes and all his problems. And Reb Uri said, you should also tell this to my brother-in-law, Reb Menachem Mendel, of course, the Rav of Kosov, where they were, the Rebbe of Kosov. So the leaseholder goes and he tells his woes to Reb Menachem Mendel. And Reb Menachem Mendel says, I'm about to go to the mikveh. I'll give you the zechus of my immersion in the mikveh, and that will help you. The Reb Moshe goes back to Reb Uri of Strelisk and tells him what happened. And Reb Uri says, go back to my brother-in-law and say that's not enough. So Reb Moshe goes back, tells Reb Menachem Mendel that his brother-in-law said that this isn't enough. It's not, this isn't it. So Uri says, Reb Menachem Mendel says, good. I'm about to put on tefillin. I'll give you the mitzvah of tefillin, and that will stand you in good stead. Reb Moshe goes back to Reb Uri of Strelisk and says what happened. He said, go back to my brother-in-law and tell him that's not enough. Goes back and says, this too is not enough. Your brother-in-law says this too is not enough. So Rabbi Menachem Mendel says, I will give you the mitzvah of every time I put on tefillin for the rest of my life, and that will stand you in good stead. Rabbi Moshe goes back to Reb Uri of Strelisk and tells him, and he says, tell my brother-in-law this isn't enough. So Reb Moshe has to go back a third time and say, listen, your brother-in-law says this is enough. So at this point, Reb Menachem Mendel goes himself to Reb Uri and says, listen, I'm giving him so many mitzvahs. What are we supposed to do? What do you want? And Rebbe says, well, what we should do is we should go to the Anash, the people, the Chassidim, that pay their dues as Chassidim, and go around and raise money so that the Reb Moshe can pay off his debts. And the two Rebbes went out together, and of course they were able to raise the money in a relatively short period of time. Reb Moshe was able to pay off his debts, and very soon was a wealthy person, again able to give large amounts of tzedakah. We often, when we're confronted with people's sorrows, we can feel their pain. We say some comforting words. But the question is, can we actually do something? Meaning, often we have the power to change the situation. It's merely because of our own situation, or we're so involved with ourselves that we don't see what we can actually do. There's a mice in the Gemara with Shmuel, the great Amora, first generation of Amoraim. It was Rav and Shmuel thing. And Rabbi Yehuda, one of their Talmidim, comes and tells him about a situation. He says, "What do you want from me? I'm not a Rav. I'm not anything. Shmuel. He didn't have smicha. He was a knowledgeable person, but formally he had no position." And Rabbi Yehuda said, "You are one of the leaders of the Jewish community of Babylon. Of course, you're capable of doing things." And Shmuel keeps on begging off. So in the end, Shmuel gets a heavenly punishment. And that is when he goes to Beis Din Shalmala, He is forever has to listen to Rav Yehuda giving shirim. He doesn't get to give shir. He doesn't get to hear his Rebbeim giving shir. He only gets to hear his Talmid give a shir. And that's because he didn't feel the pain of the person that we're talking about. I remember one of the formative things when I was a young Dayan. Very, very difficult case. I won't describe it, but I said to the woman, I'll do a get, but I'm not sure whether the get's kosher. Afterwards, I'll go to Eretz Yisrael, ask the Gedolim there, and the first Gadol I went to was Rabbi Avraham Shapiro Zatzal, former chief rabbi of the state of Israel, Rosh Yeshiva of Merkaz Rav, for that a Dayan on the base in Yerushalayim for decades. And I presented it to him, and he yelled at me. He said, don't you feel the pain and agmas nefesh, the emotional suffering that this woman has every minute that she doesn't know whether she's divorced or not? How could you cause her this much pain and suffering? Why didn't you give her the maseh based in miyad immediately? We have to measure what we can do and make sure we live up to our potential of what we can do. There's the famous story, of course, of Reb Zusha, one of the Gedolei Ador, the Talmidim of the Maggid of Mezrich, or as people from Mezrich said, Mezirich, that when he's on his deathbed, he's crying, he's scared. And the Chassidim are saying, Rebbe, what are you afraid of? You're one of the Gedolei Hador. What do you have to be afraid of? And he said, I'm not afraid if they ask me why I wasn't a tzaddik like the Baal Shem Tov. I have a simple answer. I didn't have his neshama. I couldn't be a tzaddik like him. I'm not afraid if they ask me why I wasn't a Talmud Chacham like Shlomo Melech. I didn't have his brain. I couldn't be a Talmud Chacham like Shlomo Melech. But when they ask me, Zusha, why didn't you reach the potential of Reb Zusha? Why didn't you do everything that you could have done? For that I will have no answer, and for that I will be convicted. Each of us knows, or should be able to know, what we can do, and we have to constantly strive to live up to that potential. That is one of the messages that we can have from this Parsha. Everyone should have a good and uplifting Shabbos.